Hello everyone. In today's edition of Writing Notes, we're going to talk about 3 ways of incorporating material from research sources into your essay. The fourth way, or broadly speaking, sort of fourth way, would be incorporating charts, tables, graphs, visual images, things like that. We're going to set that aside for today, and we're going to focus on 3 techniques for incorporating text or ideas from an original source into your essay. So that is quotation, paraphrase, and summary. You probably are already at least vaguely aware of what quotation is. This is where you directly use the language from an original source, presenting an author's text word for word. Sorry. Presenting an author's text word for word. So this is the most direct way of presenting material from an original source in your own work. The second option is paraphrasing. With paraphrasing, you take a particular chunk of text, a particular thing, and then you rephrase it in your own words to convey the same meaning as the original source. So this allows you to do a couple of important things that quoting doesn't let you do. One is that it allows you to keep control of the writing voice while still conveying the author's ideas. It also allows you to slightly shift the terms of the original argument so that the material is expressed in the same way that you've been talking about it in your own essay. We'll come back to this in a little bit. And then the third method of presenting source material is summary. So this is where you take a large amount of material and you condense it down into one fairly short snippet. Short here being a relative term. So it depends on how big the thing you're summarizing is, it depends on how important it is for your argument, it depends on how big your own text is. So if you, for instance, wanted to condense, say, a 10-page scholarly article, and you were doing that for a, say, 4-page long essay for a class, you might condense it into 2 sentences, 3 sentences, something like that. On the other hand, if you were condensing, say, an entire scholarly book, and you were writing your own book, you might condense that into a paragraph or 2, and just sort of give the overview. So a summary is going to focus on the main ideas, key points, maybe methodology, depending on what exactly you want out of that summary. The other thing with summary is that it doesn't necessarily need to be a whole text. So you can summarize a particular idea. So dialectic materialism, for instance, is one idea that comes to us from Karl Marx. We don't necessarily need to summarize all of Capital Volume 1 in order to talk about that particular idea. Or commodity fetishism, for instance. We can talk about that idea and summarize that idea without necessarily having to summarize the entire book out of which it comes. So, I want to first talk about how these things are set up, how these different techniques are set up, what they would visually look like on the page. Sorry. Then I want to take you through some of the reasons you would choose one or the other. So when you're setting up a quote, one of the distinct things about this is that it's the only one of these 3 techniques that's going to be in quotation marks. So that's the, I'm doing air quotes so to try and illustrate this, but quotation marks are the sort of the things that look like upside down commas. And it's worth noting that in the US we use double quotation marks. In the UK, Australia, and other sort of Commonwealth countries, you're more likely to use single quotation marks, and those are actually called inverted commas. So when you have just single quotation marks, those may be called inverted commas. When you have double quotation marks, they aren't called that, but they still look the same on the page, as sort of upside down comma at the top corners of the quote. The other thing that you want to make sure that you're doing when you're quoting material is to cite it. So MLA, APA, Chicago style, Oxford style, Harvard style. There's a ton of different citation styles, but you want to make sure that you're citing your material properly according to a recognized citation system. With paraphrasing, you're not going to put this in quotation marks because those indicate that this is word for word what an original source has said. And because with paraphrasing, you're rewriting this in your own language, you're not going to incorporate those. But you still want to make sure that you're citing this source properly, because this is still information that's coming from a source, just you're putting it into your own language. And then with summary, again, no quotation marks, so that's a fairly straightforward one. The question of whether or not you need to cite it, or how you need to cite it, is a slightly tricky one. What I would generally suggest is that if you're citing an entire text, say you wanted to cite all of Michel Foucault's book Discipline and Punish, or Wendy Brown's Undoing the Demos, for instance, if you're giving us the overall argument of this book, you want to attribute it to that author, obviously. So attribute in the sentence itself, or in the paragraph itself, or whatever it is, to Foucault or to Brown or whatever. But because you're summarizing the whole thing, it's not necessarily that beneficial to give us, say, page references, because the page reference would be the entire scope of the book, which doesn't help your audience particularly find a specific point. On the other hand, if you're summarizing just a particular idea or a particular portion of a text, it's beneficial then to give a parenthetical citation with the page numbers to where in the original text that information comes from. So if you were citing just Foucault's idea of the panopticon from Discipline and Punish, you might give us the page range where he discusses the panopticon, so we know what material you're summarizing. So, having thought through that, the next consideration is why choose one of these techniques as opposed to the others. So, some of the benefits of directly quoting. It can help build your ethos. Any of these things help build your ethos to a certain extent, because you're always incorporating source material, which is always a useful way of establishing authority. But quoting in particular can help build your credibility by saying X other person, X scholar, author, authority, whatever it is, agrees with me, or is saying the same kind of thing that I'm saying. So that's one way of particularly building your ethos. If an author has said something clearly, effectively, persuasively, in such a way that you don't think that you can say it better, that's another good reason to quote. If the other good reason to quote is if you want to look closely at the language that that author has used. This is particularly important for people who work on literature or rhetoric, political science, political philosophy, or philosophy in general. Any time where you might say, this particular author's word choice is significant because you want a direct quote. Why might you choose paraphrasing? Well, paraphrasing, as I said before, is useful if you want to put an author's argument in the same terms that you've already been using for your own argument. Usually you're not making the exact same argument that another author is when you're incorporating material from their work in to support your argument. And if you are making the exact same argument, you may want to rethink whether or not your particular paper is even worth writing if someone else has already made that claim. But you can make these minor shifts in terminology so that the way that you're talking about the way that the author is talking about a text may be more clearly connected with the way that you're talking about it. So that's useful because it incorporates evidence from a source in the same vein that you've been discussing it. So that's going to help make it clear how the author's material connects with your argument. Another benefit of paraphrasing is that you get to keep control of the writing voice. So as much as possible, you want to try and be in control of your writing voice because this is your essay, this is your argument. And so shorter quotes, fewer quotes, more paraphrasing is generally going to be better. Summary, I think the benefits of summary, the reasons for using summary are fairly straightforward. If you want to present a large-scale idea, if you want to present a lot of context, if you want to present a lot of background, history, theory, something like this, and you don't have a lot of space to develop it, summary is going to be a good technique for this. So these are the sort of broad ways of incorporating material and some of the reasons why you might choose one technique or another. The other thing that I want to say about quoting very, very quickly, and this is a formatting thing, most citation styles, at least MLA, APA, Chicago, have specific guidelines for setting up block quotes. So block quotes are when you have a very long quotation. Some people say that that's more than 4 lines of text. Some people say more than 40 words. But when you have a long quotation, it needs to be set off from the main text itself. So typically the way that that's done is you start the quote on its own line and then indent the whole thing 1/2 inch. So indent the way that you would normally indent to start a paragraph, except every line of the quote. It also, at least in MLA, doesn't get listed in quotation marks, and whereas normally the period or the question mark or the end punctuation of the sentence is outside the parenthetical citation, with a block quote, it's inside the parenthetical citation. But look up the formatting for whatever particular citation style you're using and make sure that you're doing it right. The other thing to think about with block quotes is that they are risky. The fewer of them you can have, the better, because psychologically, readers have a tendency either to skim or outright skip block quotes altogether and just go on to the next piece of your text. So that is something to keep in mind, is that readers do not often engage with block quotes as thoroughly as they do with quotes that have been incorporated directly into the text. Thanks for watching.